Hello, everyone. We will be covering Chapter 5, and we're going over the concept of the inheritance of complex traits. In 1713, when there was a new king in Prussia, he wanted to have a military with the most tallest people. And so he took pride in having this military with very tall, strong individuals. And he wanted to continue this on by mating basically pairs and couples that had very tall and strong traits. And so this project, carried on for a long time because, of course, it takes, lots of years before humans can have babies and then for them to grow up and whatnot. And even though he paired, some of the most tallest and some of the strongest, the following generations weren't necessarily as tall and as strong as their parents. And so the reason why the King of Prussia wasn't able to breed tall individuals, even though the parents were really tall, is because height in humans is a complex trait, is what we consider a complex trait, meaning that it takes a lot of different genes and a lot of different factors, even environmental factors, that contribute to height. So it's not like just a one gene type of thing like what you would see in plants. And some plants, like pea plants, when Gregor Mendel was studying pea plants, he was better able to control the generations simply because a lot of those traits were manipulated by a few genes. Now, complex traits are basically in different categories. And so, if a trait, for example, like in human height, is controlled by two or more genes, it's considered a polygenic trait, meaning poly means many. And so, this is just many genetic traits. So, not just one or two genes contribute to the height, it takes a variation of them. And multifactorial means that the traits result from the interaction of one or more environmental factors. So it could be like for height, it could be something like nutrition, the availability of nutrition, and two or more genes. And so it's a combination. And so these type of traits, excuse me, don't necessarily follow the Mendelian ratios. And so you wouldn't be able to easily predict what the next generation would look like simply because there are a lot of factors that contribute to that trait. And so, where do you think human height falls under? So, human height is polygenic and multifactorial, but mostly just multifactorial since we have environmental and multiple genes at play to control height. Skin type is also a complex trait. So, skin color is just a variation of three or four genes that produce a wide range of different types of phenotypes. So, just three or four genes control skin color, and you can get a lot of different shades of color. But it also has a partial environmental factor in that the exposure to sun and different types of weather can also contribute to the phenotypic variation, meaning that skin color can change depending on the environment. And so this type of trait is a multifactorial trait because not only more than two genes control skin color, but also the location, this outer external factor, the environment, affects skin color. So skin color in general is a complex trait. In humans, variations of skin color are due to differences in the amount of the distribution of the pigment melanin. The variations are thought to represent adaptations to the intensity of light. So if you live closer to the equator, there's more light intensity there, and so you see people tend to be more darker there simply because they get more sun. And skin color, interestingly, is controlled by these different types of genes. They're called TYR and SLC. They have these numbers just to identify what type of genes they are because there could be variants of the same type of gene. But just a difference in these combinations is what contributes to so many different shades. And SNPs, these are single nucleotide polymorphisms. This is how basically there's a lot of different SNPs in a wide range of people. And this is an interesting way to be able to identify even what race a group of people belong to because of these single SNPs. And you can read about them a little bit more in the textbook, but I'm not necessarily quizzing you on that, so you don't have anything to worry about. So there are different types of complex traits. Some examples are height, we discussed that. Skin color, we discussed that. Weight also. Eye color, intelligence. Those are just some types of complex traits under polygenic control, meaning that there are more than one gene controlling them. And there are also other types of complex traits that can happen during development. For example, cleft palate, clubfoot, diabetes and hypertension, along with some behavioral disorders, are polygenic and or multifactorial complex traits. And so they can be fall under more than one category. So it can be controlled by many genes and environmental factors. So height is strongly controlled by the role of genes. And so with the heritability of 80 to 90%, indicating that the strong role of genes is determining this trait. So that makes it more of a polygenic type of trait simply because genetics has a stronger control over height than environment. Intelligence is also considered a complex trait, meaning that it's governed by many genes and other factors. Although you could argue, how do you define intelligence? And nobody really has the most straightforward answer. There's just like this test, it's called an IQ test, which measures somebody's chronological age to their mental age. And so a psychologist basically came up with this type of test, and an individual takes this test, and if a child, let's say for example, is 7 years old, that's their chronological age, that's their real age, was able to perform task of a 7-year-old but could not perform task of an 8-year-old, and this is based on an exam, they would be scored a mental age of 7. And to determine the IQ, you would multiply the mental age of 7 to the chronological age. And so mental age of 7 score, chronological age is 7. You take the quotient, which is 1, and then you multiply it by 100. And so that's how, and so this individual would have an IQ of 100. They would be right in the range that they need to be. And so if the individual, let's say, is 7 years old, but scores at a mental age of 10, then you would do 10 divided by 7, and you would probably get like 1.3, 1.4, and they may have an IQ of like 130, 140 or something like that. And so, an IQ test does not necessarily define intelligence, but it shows that it's a complex type of trait. And so studies have shown that intelligence can be inherited and environmental, so it can be a combination. And some studies that were done were with maternal twins, dizygotic twins, meaning that they don't look alike. They're not like the clones of each other, not like the maternal ones. And studies were taken of their IQ, and so twins that were born and raised in the same household, pretty much almost scored identical. But then they found that it could also be environmentally influenced, so not just inherited, because they've had other studies in which maternal twins were raised in different households, and their IQs actually they didn't correlate as high. So you can inherit, intelligence, but also the environmental factors can influence intelligence as well.